because there is a grocery store literally several miles away from me, or I have to create my own food because the GMOs that they put in the vegetables at my local store or whatever may kill me or may inflame a chronic illness that I have. Like, so I know that's not what you meant, but like that's definitely what I've been thinking about as far as like how are all of these things tied together. Because also when thinking about enslavement, I'm thinking about like I'm thinking of like forced birth and things like that, that under enslavement, like chattel, like forced birth was a purposeful tool to produce labor. So, and I'm thinking about all of these things at once, and I'm not exactly sure how to connect them, but those are just some of the historical things that like come up in my mind.
Well, I think when you stop and think about the relationship that African Americans, people of color, and indigenous people have had with land. So, being the granddaughter of a sharecropper and realizing that land is power. And when land was taken from the indigenous people, it was a power play. But then when they took the land, they didn't even know how to utilize it. And then they had to go get a group of people, to your point, through the farmers who had the ability. We wouldn't have certain crops if we didn't have our ancestors here. So I think when you talk about EJ and when you talk about RJ, and my colleague and partner in crime, Tony, is on the line. There'll be
yeah. Hey, Tony.
I think when you see how we will be messaging and interpreting the language, we're blessed to have a multi-generational compadre, the two of us together. And so I get to bring a little bit more of the historical lineage. And then, you know, living through my last 60 years of existence. So guys, I'm really proud of all of you, quite frankly. And so thank you for welcoming me to the club.
Thank you.
Well, we appreciate your wisdom.
Right.
Well, they don't call us modern elders for nothing.
True story.
And then of course we don't want to hog the mic, so if anyone else wants to unmute yourself and like kind of comment or just like, you know, suggest anything or anything that's kind of like been stirring in your brain, I welcome it.
Nadia has a comment, Gayla, if you want to read it. It came before Valerie's.
Oh, the one about I think folks don't understand the different layers of environmental issues and how that affects our reproductive health and rights. I mentioned this event to a friend who does EJ work, but was confused about how the two intersect. It's fascinating how folks don't see the connection. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And truthfully, if it wasn't because I am Black and Southern and was in the reproductive justice movement, like, I don't know if I would have seen the connection either. Like, and I mentioned being Black and Southern in that I am the descendants of sharecroppers and enslaved Africans. And I know several members of my family farm and garden and all types of stuff. So like greenness is in my DNA. So, and that informs how like different ways I understand like justice throughout the world. So yeah, I guess that's something I pose to y'all, Agbo and Allison. What are some ways do you think people miss the connection between EJ and RJ?
I mean, I think specifically if you like, I mean, I guess most tangibly, if you want to have a healthy like pregnancy, right, like that you're impacted by like the environment that you live in. It's by the water you drink, the air you breathe, you know, if you have access to just food, right, in order just to have and these are considerations you have to make before you even decide if you want to have, you know, a pregnancy and eventually have a child, right? So if you don't have access to clean water or food or you know air pollution, that's not creating space for you to make, you know, these liberatory decisions about your bodies and to have agency. I think when we talk about like, you know, choice, if like your choice is, you know, death or do this other thing, then like that's not really a choice there, right? So that's sort of how I like make that connection most like, you know, tangible. Just that your environment impacts the way you're able to have just healthy pregnancies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it also impacts like other forms of cancer, like uterine cancer and other things that impact people with uteruses. But I think that is the most explicit link. We could talk about all these other links like breast milk and how contaminants get into that, and that gets transferred to infants. And yeah, so and that you are more receptive to toxins as a pregnant person. So it doesn't just impact like your pregnancy, but it also impacts you and your overall health. And that these are disproportionately borne by people giving birth and by caregivers. If you're the one caregiving, you're also taking on that exposure, and also the harm that it does to children is like added stress and burden onto you. So that's another way that it's a reproductive justice and health issue.
Also bringing in like that justice piece, the fact that, you know, whether it's like, you know, these nuclear power plants, you know, lead in the dirt, that, you know, polluted, you know, communities with polluted water are primarily Black and brown low income communities. That's a justice issue. That's when we get to the crux of, oh, okay, now we got to talk about racism. Now we got to talk about classism and why it's impacting these communities specifically. Because when we talk about climate change as a whole, Allison, you already uplifted this, like it's going to impact Black, brown, low income folks, disabled folks the most. Like, you know, rich white folks are going to be okay, right? Like, you know, ultimately they're going to be okay.
Always.
But when we're talking about, you know, environmental disasters, climate change, it's always those who are most vulnerable anyways who are going to be impacted. And how do we challenge those systems that make it so?
Yeah. Julian, I saw you raised your hand. I want to give you a space to speak.
Hey, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Hey, thanks a lot, guys. This was a great panel, great, a lot of information. I wanted to hear some more information. How do you all believe, or how I connect the queer and trans movement? Why are these interwoven with the queer and trans liberation?
These as in like environmental justice, or just RJ
Yeah, and just both. You know, I'm not one that has come from, you know, I just started calling people they and them, you know, to within a year or two. And, you know, it's just an interesting experience going through people who I don't know, you know, that many trans and queer. So it's just, I'd like to hear some more information about how EJ and RJ, yeah, how they're connected.
I mean, I think how I see it is how when we're talking about any sort of justice movement, it's our duty to sort of center those who are most, not only most impacted, um, but most disenfranchised in the current systems that we have, right? So when we do make an intentional effort to talk about queer and trans folks, it's because in the current systems that we have, it's because we're not centering those voices, we're not talking about those voices, and because of that, you know, queer and trans, you know, violence is perpetuated against queer and trans folks. They have disproportionate negative outcomes because we're not centering those folks. And it's sort of the concept that like once we center those voices, everyone is supposed to benefit, right? And I guess to tie it, I guess to like the environmental justice piece, like specifically, Gayla, I don't know if you want to speak to that a bit. I know you sort of thing.
Oh yeah. Well, I appreciate what you've already uplifted. Well, Julian, hello. My name is Gayla. I am a queer and trans person. Hello. So, and I mainly bring that up because your question is around, like, I just now, from what I hear from your question is that, like, you are still like, you still have like an intro to queer and trans people, which that's not a judgment or anything. That's just me being like, hey, that's me. So like, and I mention that because you may know more queer and trans people than you may think. And I say that also because when we're talking about justice, when we're talking about equity, we're talking about everybody. So the reason why I brought up rural Georgians when we're talking about environment is because if I'm not talking about climate solutions for everyone, I'm not talking about climate solutions. For instance, like, if let's say, queer and trans people are a part of the population. So if you're not centering or engaging queer and trans people in your solutions, in your work, that means essentially you're saying that, I care about clean energy for some. Like, I care about clean air for some. So I think as far as like how queer and trans liberation is integral to both environmental and reproductive justice is very much so a part of human rights. I believe that abortion is a human right. I believe clean air, clean energy, wellness, I believe not being subjected to energy burden and these different things are a part of humanity, things that you are owed. So that's kind of like bring how I bring queer and trans, because it's also my identity. So I use my identities to inform how I lead, how I strategize with my comrades, with fellow organizers. So when we're thinking about queer and trans liberation, it's mainly us saying like liberation for all of us, or it's not liberation. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it's just to say it's not that like LGBTQ or queer folks have like you need unique environments. It's that you're like disproportionately impacted and very